Hello, I'm Ernie Humphrey, the CEO of Treasury Careers. I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us for our webinar today, Mastering Dashboards to Deliver Strategic Value from FP&A. I would like to thank our webinar partner, Centage, a leader in automated budgeting and planning software solutions for small and medium-sized organizations, whose Budget Maestro family of software products provide thousands of financial leaders with greater insight into their business performance and increased confidence in their decision-making, and whose commitment to thought leadership helps us make this webinar possible today. Dashboards have become a powerful tool for FP&A to share insight and gain respect. When designed correctly, they deliver a clear message on what's working and what's not, and the actions to take to fix issues. Technology now enables us to create dashboards in minutes, allowing us to share information in ways we never thought before. You must leverage this technology. The big question has moved from how do we create dashboards to how do we harness this powerful tool to drive business behavior. Before I delve into the content, I'm going to offer a few quick words about Treasury Careers, cover a few housekeeping items, review our learning objectives for the webinar, and then I'm going to welcome our featured speaker, James Myers, to the webinar. Treasury Careers offers content and resources that empower Treasury professionals to own their career success. Great job opportunities posted on treasuryjobs.com. We have many Treasury certification resources. We have complimentary webinars like this one today, and we also have several articles around Treasury best practices. Now, on to our exciting housekeeping items. The slides are currently available under the handouts area in your GoToWebinar control panel. They'll be sending you links via email to the presentation and the webinar recording over the next 24 hours. If you're interested in receiving CTP or FP&A credits via the AFP certification programs, you'll have to answer all polling questions and remain on for the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions regarding CTP credit or FP&A credit, please send me an email to ernie@360thoughtleadership.com. We'd like to hear from you today, so we encourage you to ask your questions in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll do our best to get to your questions at the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Fear not, if we do not get to your question, we will follow up with you directly after the webinar. Finally, we appreciate your consideration in taking a short survey at the end of the webinar today, as we always strive to improve the ROI we offer our event attendees for their valuable time. Our learning objectives represent our value proposition to you in attending the webinar today. We'd like you to be able to understand data and how your company can harness it to empower data-driven decision-making. I'd like you to understand the data maturity model and how to accelerate your data transformation, to discover recommendations on improving the quality of your dashboards, and get a good sense of the future of data analytics. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome James Myers to the webinar, who's going to deliver on the learning objectives I've just outlined for you. James is the founder and CEO of FP&A Strategy Consulting, a company focusing on accelerating finance transformation. He is passionate about FP&A and presented at various finance summits. He is a qualified chartered accountant, and he's held various finance and operation leadership roles in multinationals such as Dell and Nokia, and has clients such as Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. James, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Thanks, Ernie, for the introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me here today. The role of the Office of the CFO is changing, and it's moving away from this idea of traditional compliance such as SOX, tax, close processes, gap compliance, and things like optimization. Now, was traditionally core within the organization, is now becoming just part of the CFO function. The CFO function is also now moving towards a more customer-facing growth focus, as well as a strategic role, which is really about understanding the market, suggesting new opportunities, and predicting market changes. The third kind of change that we're seeing in the CFO, the Office of the CFO, is really, they're now becoming more responsible for just being disruptive, focusing on what's next. So historically, the Office of the CFO has always been very traditional, back office looking, compliance, etc. We're now seeing them taking on a far more strategic role. And we see that dashboards is one of the tools that not only helps in, making things simpler from a compliance point of view, or just kind of a dissemination of data point of view, but it actually helps with becoming more strategic. The challenges, though, that we're seeing is that the CFOs are, as they start to work and become more focused on strategic advisory and business partnering, the challenge that they have, and if you go to the next bit, Ernie, the challenge that they do have is that there's just not enough time for them to kind of be time to invest in activities that would really break the mold. So this is some of the research done by Gary Simon, and what we're finding is that, especially in the office of the CFO, they have a lot of challenges, and time is one of the biggest issues. So if we go to the next slide. So we're very excited because with the collaboration of 360 Thought Leadership, the FP&A Trends, and FP&A Strategy, we've launched a groundbreaking survey which is completely focused on FP&A and the empowerment of FP&A. This survey will be released in November 2017, but just to kind of give you a little bit of insight into some of these key indicators that we found out. Finance professionals are spending 46% of their time on low-value activities. So these are things like collecting data, validating data, pulling together data from organizations for planning, etc. And they're only spending 20% of their time on the high-value activities. These are activities, for example, like business partnering, and really getting a deeper understanding of the business and becoming more strategic. So within the organization, and FP&A as being a subset of the Office of the CFO, we're definitely seeing these trends of time being a major issue within an organization. We also, the flip side of that question was, how much time would you like to spend on high-value activities? And the answer that came back was just under 50% of their time. So it's really almost doubling the amount of time on high-value activities within the function. The other thing that was very apparent is that a lot of the time, especially when we're looking at organizations and we centering around the idea of how do we create dashboards and insights for the organization, almost 51% of the time is spent on data collection and data validation. So 20% on data collection and an amazing 31% on the data validation. This is an amazing insight because half the time that people are spending it on things that just don't add any value within the organization. Another 30% is also spent on information, dispensing information. So that only leaves about just less than 20% on really being able to drive the organization forward from an analytics and dashboarding point of view. 35% of FP&A professionals said that their large numbers of their organization decisions rely on data. So what we're saying here is that 55% of companies aren't using data as kind of the driving force for decision making. Another staggering statistic: 56% of FP&A professionals don't see that their work is impacting operating profit. When we especially in the FP&A function, which is very forward-focused and very focused on underlying understanding of the business and how to drive that business forward, as well as understanding the future of the business, especially when we're doing planning and things like that. It's amazing to see that so few people believe that they're having a real impact to the bottom line. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen here to be able to drive the value within the organization. 61% of FP&A professionals said that to really drive analytic maturity, they need technology upgrades, 31%, and then increased collaboration within the organization. So all of these things are really around driving value to the organization. And we can understand where the challenges are. Some of the challenges are, technology. Some of them are just time. So if we go to the next slide. So really, when we think about value, there's kind of key value aspects that we really want to be able to drive. The idea is active partnership, which is working very closely with our business partners to understand the business and provide them with insight, not just data, and be able to work closely with them to kind of drive the business forward. Proactive resolution. This is really looking at understanding where the challenges are, what are the problem statements that we're trying to solve, instead of just disseminating a lot of data. And then insight-driven strategy. Often what we see is that a lot of FP&A function is reactive instead of proactive. Where we really see a lot of value driven within an organization is really to understand in a lot of detail the strategy and be able to convert that strategy into actions, taking those actions, really understanding the driver of those actions. And that's where we can do a lot of the data insights to be able to kind of drive the actions. Taking all of these into consideration, we'll be able to, as an organization, change the game to win. And that's kind of the objective of this. And dashboards play a critical role in all of these aspects. If we go to the next slide. So if we look at the FP&A cycle, where we see the cycle starting, we talked a bit about strategy, understanding the strategy, and typically what we do is we deliver the strategy within the organization and take that strategy and distill it down into a plan. That plan is kind of like the key element of disseminating that strategy to the business. So understanding and integrating that strategy and being able to build out a plan that aligns with the strategy of the company is critical. Once we have that strategy at the business, what we really need to do is start to work with the business to understand where their challenges are. What are the things that are the big things that they're struggling with, the big questions that they have, the pain points that they have. Once we understand those, what we can go and do is we can go to the data. And what we really want to be able to do is we really want to start with the business problems as opposed to the data first. So typically, what I've seen in a lot of organizations is where a lot of organizations start is they start with the data and they disseminate that down to the business. Where we really need to start is understanding the business challenges and problem statements, and then go and get the data. And often, when you do it that way around, you find that the data doesn't always support. We often have to go and find additional data to kind of answer some of the challenges that the business have. And this is where we drive through insight. The value of insight is really driven by the business themselves. Do they find that insight useful? But one of the steps that often is missing out of all of this is really, once we have those insights, what do we do with them? The ideal scenario would be to help drive those insights back into the strategy. If we find something that's incredible, that the business had a question from, and we found an insight that was that made a significant difference to the business, then the idea would be to drive that back into the strategy, so that becomes ingrained in the culture of the organization, and then the cycle continues. So for an FP&A value cycle, we really see that the value is driven by these three elements, and being able to move from these three elements in a cycle. Now, where dashboards fit in is really kind of between the business and the data. Once you've understood your business problems, the best way to disseminate that data is often in dashboards. Next slide.
All right. Thanks, James. I'm going to go ahead and launch our first polling question. And James, could you do me a favor and maybe toggle over to your speaker? We're getting a little sound inconsistency, so maybe you can look at doing that while we have the poll up. So you can see I've gone ahead and launched our first polling question. Our first polling question is asking you to share with us what the most challenging issue your company faces when it comes to reporting, too much complexity in financial data, too many inconsistencies in taxonomy and definitions, no single source of the truth that everyone trusts, data is not timely or out of date, or everyone is working offline Excel, no one gets the big picture. I want to remind all of you that are interested in CTP or FP&A credit, we need you to answer all the polling questions. Of course, we appreciate everyone's consideration in answering all of our polling questions during the webinar. I am going to go ahead and leave the polling question up for another 3 or 4 seconds, and I'm going to go ahead and share the results and get James's initial take on the results. Then we're going to get back into James' compelling conversation and get more in depth into why dashboards. So let me go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and close the polling question and go ahead and share the results. And a quick look. Any initial thoughts here, James?
Yes, so this is one of the questions that was in the survey that we asked, and I think the results are coming out very similar to what we've seen. Excel is still used throughout the organization, and the challenges that we often see with Excel is that you can do these manipulations offline. So the idea is that you have a single source of data, people extract that data, they do a whole lot of manipulation, and then they present that as their output. And what we're missing is, and what we're losing is the insight that people were making of those adjustments. The ideal scenario would be to kind of try to pull that back into the source system. So if adjustments are made at an Excel level, then bringing those insights back into the source system would be critical. But where we see in finance, complexity is a big challenge. Especially the amount of ERPs that we've seen out in the marketplace. There continues to be the idea of, if you've got more than one, then you're constantly reconciling between data sets, and the idea of no single source of the truth. I think those are the big three that are pretty much coming out the same, which I think are consistent across the board.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
So why dashboard? Okay. There's a couple of reasons why you would want to have a dashboard. They can make complex things understandable. So really what we're talking about here is we can take a huge amount of data and we can put it in a very simple visual form. So the human brain works a lot better seeing a visualization as opposed to a lot of data. So although finance people are traditionally very focused on kind of the data and often require, when we're presenting data, require the detail, often when we look at insights and trends and things like that, visualizations are very impactful. They're excellent communication tools, especially when you're looking at executive level management and things like that. But being able to build out a data, have the data update automatically, and disseminate that data down to the organization on a almost real-time basis, it kind of prevents the idea of, historically, I remember in FP&A probably about 15 years ago, we used to have to send out emails every day on kind of sales results. We don't have to do that anymore. The data is all made available to people. Help the business align and drive behaviors aligned with the strategy. I think this is kind of the more critical one about dashboards. I was on a project about 2 years ago, and we developed a whole bunch of dashboards for sales organization. And one of the big things was they were changing the way that they were focusing the sales organization. And there was a lot of conversation about how do we change how do we incentivize the sales organization to follow this new methodology? In the end, we decided to design a range of dashboards that focused on the key indicators, and those indicators were owned by the CEO of the company. And the CEO every day checked those indicators and asked the team questions about those indicators. Suddenly, that direction and vision was distilled down to the sales team, because they knew that they needed to understand those KPIs and really understand how to impact them. So that was a critical change of the business without having to pay money to incentivize people. The nice thing about dashboards, they can be interpreted at a glance. So you can take in a whole lot of information very quickly. And also with new dashboards these days, they're all available on the internet, on the web, and things like that. So it's very easy to make them accessible to a large number of people. And the nice thing I've always found, my favorite thing about dashboards, is that often they're self-correcting. When you have a dashboard, it's not like an Excel spreadsheet. It really, the information is there on the web or given to you, and you can't then go and change it. You really have to change the data that underlies that, and that helps to self-correct the dashboard. If there's an error in the data and people notify you, then you can correct the data and get the dashboard to reflect the right number, and being able to push that data back down into that source, into that golden source. So those are all the great things about dashboards. Now, the reality is, if you go to the next slide, the reality with dashboards is unfortunately slightly different. What happens with dashboards is that because dashboards are so easy to create these days, so many dashboards are being created by different parts of the organization, by different people, that it almost becomes overwhelming. What's important, what isn't important. Where we've seen the best impact of this is where we have dashboards that are controlled by a central organization. And what we're seeing is that almost a business intelligence insights team is being established within finance organization as part of the FP&A team, where they are responsible for all the financial dashboards within the organization. I'm recently working on a project where we're establishing that team and have grown that team up. The team typically has a blend of finance people and BI people and then technical data people. But where this becomes the most powerful is that we can take centralize the data, be able to disseminate that data across the board. Some of the other the realities that we're seeing is that often there's too many metrics. On one project that I was working on, I think the organization was trying to run their business on 150 metrics, which makes it very difficult to figure out what direction we should be going. Typically, you want to have one or at least about 4 metrics that help drive the organization, which are your key metrics. You may have additional metrics that underlie those metrics, but ultimately, we want to have as few metrics as possible. And those metrics might change over time, and we'll get into that in a bit more detail. The worst thing that you can have is conflicting metrics, and I've seen this a lot, is where you have one metric which is actionable, and if you take those actions, then it makes one change. But then you have another metric which drives the opposite. So really what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to make sure that your dashboarding is built in such a way that you are able to have the metrics together drive the business in one direction as opposed to conflicting with each other. A lot of the time as well, metrics are just designed to disseminate information. They aren't designed to help organizations decide what they should do or actions they should take. We've seen some metrics, and this is probably getting less of an issue because of the technology we see these days, but poor user experience where it's difficult to see the metrics or use the metrics. And then my favorite reality of all of this is low adoption. If you have a dashboard out there at the moment, one of the critical things that you need to measure is the adoption of that dashboard. How many people are using your dashboard? It's critical to understand that because the value is only driven by the people that are using it. What you can do if you see that you have low adoption, what we've done in the past, I just did was working on a dashboard where we had some low adoption. What we did is we actually had a look at who was looking at the dashboard and actually spoke to those people. And what we have found out is that a lot of people were using it for a different thing, but not exactly the way that it was set up. So what we ended up doing is refining that dashboard to include some of the use cases that that organization needed for their function, which made it far more powerful. And once you've got a good use case, it's a lot easier to spread the word of being able to get adoption within your dashboards. But again, adoption is a critical piece. Next slide. But the challenge we have is that data is overwhelming, and really being able to use dashboards to consolidate and disseminate information is critical. But it's becoming, data is growing at an astronomical rate. I think the last statistic I saw, it was doubling every 2 years. So it's growing exponentially. Next slide. But the nice thing about data is it comes really in 3 flavors. It comes in what's known as the known knowns, or the known unknowns, or the unknown unknowns. The known knowns are things that we know. And these are typically your historical data set, what's happened in the past, what your revenue is, your historic KPIs and things like that. This is where, dashboards, what the value that dashboards add in this area is really about time saving. We saw that the Office of the CFO is really struggling with the idea of time. One of the biggest challenges they have is spending a lot of time on things like collecting data and then things like validating data. Almost 50% of all analytical time is spent on that. Where the organization, the FP&A organization, can help is to create these single source of truths within the organization, where there's one point of data that contains all the truths of that requirement, and that enables you to then build out a dashboard able to take the known knowns and really disseminate them throughout the organization, so that people have access to that information. So what that part is really doing in dashboards help here is more about time saving. The next one is the known unknowns. These are the things that we know we don't know. And often these things, the known knowns, typically don't change a lot, but the data underlying them do change. So here, dashboards can play a huge role in being able to provide information on things like forecasting and projecting out, things like that. So, there's a lot of functionality now in dashboards that you can do forecast projections and things like that. An example is we applied the system generated forecast, highs and lows against a forecast to see if it fell in a 95 percentile range. We found that it didn't, and what we discovered was that it was because somebody had put in a manual override. So the forecast, because they wanted to uplift the forecast. So there was a risk that we were going to miss that forecast. So there's a lot of opportunity to not only spend time on things that you already have, like the KPIs and the historical data, but to really start to delve into these known unknowns. The other one, the unknown unknowns. These are things that we just don't know. We don't know. There's huge amounts of opportunity within dashboards. Because dashboards are so visual, they're able to kind of drive a lot of questions that we didn't even think about before. An example of this is when I did some work for a vitamin company, they found that at one of their stores, they were selling a huge amount of vitamins, but it made it up onto the top 20 list, but it was only being sold in 3 stores. What they found is when they dug into it, they had a really strong marketing program in those 3 stores. So when they were able to expand it out to 300 stores, they were able to, make significant amounts of profit. But they didn't even think about looking at that information and looking at that insight. How many an average of vitamins by store until they'd seen that on a visualization. So there's a lot of opportunity in the unknown unknowns. But really, where I see the focus of FP&A is really doing the known unknowns, getting that out of the way, saving people time, and then really focusing their attention on the known unknowns. That's where the real value is. Okay, next slide. The data is alive. We have volumes of data that are continually changing. We have different forms of data. When we think about answering business questions, we don't only think about the data within the enterprise, the ERP systems or the CRM systems, but we also have to think about data from a lot of other different sources, maybe external, maybe internal, maybe created within a department. So don't limit yourself just to the data that you have. The velocity of data is very important because data gets stale very quickly. The sooner that people can have it, the better. And being able to give people access to the data as soon as possible, and the veracity of data, really understanding the accuracy of that data and being able to build out solutions that provide insight to people. Next slide. So we're experimenting with a model, the maturity model of data, to really help underline dashboards. And it's very critical. I think, it's easy to say, dashboards are a powerful tool, but until you get your data right, they cannot provide too much value. if you find that there's errors in your dashboards and things like that, then people start to lose interest in them. So getting your data right in the beginning is critical. So we've come up with this idea of the data maturity, and it's really about building that foundation of data. Where the idea here is aggregating everything into a single source to bring it into a single platform. So what we're doing, there's a lot of things like data lakes out there. But data lake is a repository of data that holds pretty much every single piece of data within your enterprise. The idea of a data lake is that it has high processing power as opposed to a data warehouse, which doesn't. So you're able to kind of understand your data and manipulate your data. What we find is that these things become data swamps very quickly. So sometimes, for FP&A, especially in finance, we don't need the level of transactional data. We don't, I'm always of the opinion that of the 80-20 rule. I want my dashboards to answer 80% of my problems, and the 20% is normally done kind of deep drill downs and things like that, where you don't necessarily, you can jump into the detailed data. So what we do typically with a data lake is we provide a layer on the top there, which has summarized data. We summarize it up some hierarchies and build out a solution where the data becomes more manageable and more understandable. It's not necessarily at a transactional data, but the transactional data is still there if people want to go and drill into it. It just doesn't provide information into the dashboard. And this is where you really want to start to aggregate that data into that single source, which doesn't necessarily need to come just from a data lake. It can come from other databases within the organization. It can come from Excel spreadsheets. It can come from within, anything within the organization or from outside the organization. The next critical piece is master data management. Master data management is probably one of the hardest and time-consuming pieces of work that you will have to undertake when you driving and building out dashboards. Making sure that all of your data has the same taxonomy and the same meaning throughout the organization is a big challenge, especially in well-established organizations, because although data can mean one thing for one organization, it can mean a completely different thing for another organization. And being able to standardize that is critical to be able to provide insight across an organization. If people have different understanding of data in one organization, it makes it extremely difficult. So it's really about standardizing data dimensions, rules, and things, and making it more consistent. The other part of this is also to bring those data sets that are historically offline in Excel spreadsheets into the system as well. The third one is about access and providing a user-friendly business intelligence tool. And it's really about exploring, and understanding what BI tools are out there. The BI tools out there at the moment are extremely powerful and are able to, provide a lot of data manipulation as well as data visualization. So, being able to dashboard and provide access to the right people and the right levels. This part is also about understanding who your users are and what access you want to be able to grant those people at the different intersections of data. Making the data more actionable. So here we want to, really help to drive behavior within the organization. So when we look at the types of data, we don't only want to look at the historical, the known knowns, but we also want to start to look at the unknown unknowns and start to drive behavior within the organization. And then making people accountable. Really, once they have that data and they're familiar with it and continue to use it, we need to be able to help the organization understand the importance of that data and really help, especially the CEOs in the organization underneath them, be able to adopt that data and use that to drive their business forward. And that's one of the critical things. And really, where we see that is where they understand, and we can track adoption and see that adoption really taking hold. Great. Next slide. So there's a new concept that I've heard a couple of times, and we're starting to hear it more and more. It's the idea of this integrated reporting. Now, historically, through the supply chain organization, there was this concept of integrated planning. And integrated planning is where you combine different metrics and drivers to understand kind of your planning. But, the organization has now adopted integrated planning through not only its supply chain, but it's a wider part of the organization. What we're seeing is, though, that it's not as apparent within the reporting organization, although it's becoming more popular, and I've heard this being mentioned a few times. But what we mean by integrated reporting is really, let's not silo our reporting within an organization. So when we think about finance reporting, we don't want to just use financial data. We also want to use operational data, organizational data, and sort of overhead data. So when we think of organizational data, we're thinking about things like headcount and things like that. So when we look at financial data, not only do we want to look at, for example, salary costs, but we also want to look at underlying headcount trends. And typically, these are the drivers. When we look at sales data, we don't want to only look at the revenue that's generated, but we also want to start looking at things like Salesforce.com and some of our CRM systems to really help to understand how the organization is performing. What are the drivers that are driving my financial data? So really trying to get an insight into what the future could look like using those drivers. And then a lot of the other overhead data, for example, marketing statistics and trends like that, or facilities and things. So what do my underlying costs look like? The idea, and then of course we talked a bit about master data, making sure that you standardize your master data. So when you bring all of these into a single source and are able to start to build dashboards that not only touch on the finance, but also on the on various other areas of the parts of the business. So I'll give you an example. We've just finished a travel dashboard, and travel dashboard starts with our financial performance. It also then jumps into the next part down is also how are we trending on our approvals. So for travel, all travel has to go through an approvals tool. So what is that looking like? Have there been any peaks and troughs? And so that's a leading indicator on how the outcome of our financial impact on travel. And what we saw is that there was a spike one time, but then we could quickly identify what was causing that spike. And then it goes down into the bookings tool. So we have outsourced travel bookings, and what we were doing is we were looking at understanding kind of how does that then translate into what is being booked, and then again how does that translate into the general ledger. So it's a full circle, and you can understand, you can start to track drivers, and you can see the impact. Now, if you've got data on the approval side of things, you can make changes before it hits the financial systems. If you see your approvals ramping up and you understand that there's a challenge in your organization and people are traveling, maybe you can look at that and see if that is actually needed. So where traditionally we've always just, for example, presented travel, we now have a lot more of what the underlying drivers are for that to be able to start to become more actionable. One of the key things that we try to do as well is standardized reporting suites. So we have the standardized suites of reports. Now, they're not fixed, so we can continually update them, and they have their key drivers, key metrics, and then from those metrics, a few underlying metrics. But what we, especially within the finance organization, what you always need to provide is an ad hoc environment so that people can go and drill into those data models and be able to drive insights that way. Next slide. So here's a few tips and tricks for dashboards. I think we're going to jump into each of these in a bit more detail, but once you've got your data sorted out, it's really about how do you create value within your dashboards so that you can really drive value within your organization. So the four are simplifying, design thinking, take action, and storytelling. Next slide. Okay, we're going to jump into a polling question.
Yeah, thanks, James. I want to go ahead and jump in the polling question before you went into each of those four areas. So we're asking you to share with us what are the most important reasons why you've seen dashboards fail. A, too much information, too many messages, user interface too difficult to use, unable to drill down into the data, limited executive support, or inaccurate data. I appreciate everyone's consideration in answering all of our polling questions. Again, those of you interested in CTP or FP&A credits, we'll need you to answer all of our polling questions. Again, we can take your questions in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. James is a fantastic expert and wealth of knowledge, so I want you to take advantage of the opportunity to tap into his knowledge. So I'm going to go ahead and close that polling question down and take a quick look at that and see if James has any initial thoughts. Then we'll get back into the tips and tricks, starting with how to simplify. So let me go ahead, close that, and go ahead and share those results. And James, what's your initial thoughts here?
Yeah, I think this is pretty much standard within an organization. It's just, because dashboards are just so easy to create, there's just so much information and too many messages. And that's why we are looking in definitely in larger organizations, but it might be an organization or a person that is delegated to take responsibility for being able to manage dashboards throughout the finance organization. And we see, we're definitely seeing a trend of, this idea of too much information, and the way, there's definitely a need to be able to manage that. I think some of the other things, a drill down capability, that's surprising. A lot of the functionality in a lot of the tools these days have the ability to drill down. So that's a bit of a surprise to me. And user interface is low. And that was expected. The one that I think that I was find a bit unusual is just how low limited executive support. I think is really, if you want to be able to be successful in dashboards, executive support is critical to be able to make dashboards successful, and especially the adoption of dashboards. If the executive is looking at a dashboard, the team will be looking at a dashboard, and I think that for me is the one that kind of stands out as well. Quite a lot. Okay, let's jump into kind of. So really, it's what we really want to be able to do is we really want to be able to take the dashboards and simplify them. And we saw from that polling question that this is a big challenge within most organizations. So go to the next slide. Really, we want to, the tips for simplification are really, let's center around 3 to 4 key metrics. What we need to do as well within the dashboards themselves is try and reduce the noise and really being able to align to the strategy. We'll go to the next slide. So this is a bit of work that was done by Edward Tuft, and I think it was in the 70s or 80s, where it was really about, when you're looking at dashboards, being able to reduce the amount of noise. This is a dashboard, and this was taken from the Dark Horse Analytics blog. But it's really a dashboard on the left-hand side where you can see a lot of information, very distracting, a lot of colors. What we really wanted to do is kind of highlight the fact that bacon is kind of like the area that we really want to focus on for whatever reason that is. And often what I do is I do something similar to this, and then it depends on what the flavor of the month is. We can kind of change the colors. So bacon is definitely the one in this one that we're focusing on. But you can see how we've got rid of a lot of the noise on the left-hand side. The number, the left-hand side axis. We've got rid of the, a lot of the other detail, the lines, etc., to really try and simplify the visualization and make it more impactful. So when we think about, visualizations themselves, we really, this is how we want to make them impactful. So if we go to the next slide. So the next slide, we talk about aligning to a strategy. Now, remember we said that we wanted 3 to 4 metrics to really help to drive the organization. The way that I go about deciding what those 3 or 4 metrics are is really about understanding the strategy and really driving from the strategy to the coherent actions and the underlying drivers of those actions. So this is a great book. It kind of covers the ways of good strategy, and it's really about diagnosis. What are the challenges that the company is facing? It might be short term, it might be long term. What are the guiding policies to overcome those challenges? So what are the guardrails that we want to put in place to say, okay, we're going to overcome this. And this is normally done by strategy organization, but it's always important that I think finance have a seat at that table. But what we're really interested in is what are the coherent actions, and coherent meaning that they're not conflicting actions that are coming out of the strategy that we really want to drive, because finance has the power to be able to drive actions within the organization. And this is where it becomes even more important to understand that, and overcoming the challenges within the guardrails or the guiding principles, and really being able to drive those actions. So let's go to the next slide. So here's a quick example of a strategy where a company wants to become the leader by unit market share in their organic market, and they want to position themselves for long-term growth, but they want to maintain their partners and customers, or a strong relationship with their partners and customers. So this is just a mock example of potentially, and not too detailed, but kind of give you the essence. So there's three main pillars of where they see kind of that. So the top one is kind of what their challenge is. Then we see kind of what the areas they want to focus on the actions. So the key objective is kind of the action, and then how do we measure success in each one of those? And then the idea is to drill down into the key drivers. And what we've done here is we've taken customer experience, by maintain a high level of customer awareness and react quickly to change. The market share growth of 1% per quarter, and then a focused retail reps on targeting. So how do the key drivers of being able to drive that customer experience is by having people on the ground in front of the customer, understanding the customer needs, and really being able to kind of drive revenue that way. So if we go to the next slide. So this is a mock-up of a potential dashboard, just trying to understand. And the one that really was designed for this is to kind of look at the bottom right-hand side there, where each of the stores is driven is listed in the bottom right-hand side there, and they're listed by the biggest opportunity, the biggest market share that they have. And the idea here is for the sales team to understand this metric and to be able to increase their overall market share is by really focusing their attention on the ones that have the biggest opportunity. Now, what you'll see is kind of the ones sort of that don't have the biggest opportunity, we seem to have the biggest market share. So there's a great opportunity of learning from those ones that are down on the right-hand side to really bring that insight to the ones on the left-hand side. This one was designed as a 6-week trend, and then the idea would be to put like the last week's number next to that, so you can see the difference. Now, what you would want to do is you would want to have your sales and marketing team and your field force team, and you would want to understand what programs there were, and then really measure the difference and the impact that they're having on market share by the various programs, and seeing which programs are successful, which ones aren't. So it's really about how do we make our metrics more actionable, so we can see real results from a market. Next slide. The next one is about design thinking principles. When we're designing dashboards, it's really about understanding who the user is, what do they need, and often there's more than one user. So for example, there might be the executives, then there might be the finance organization underneath that are looking for information. And what we have to understand is how do we design that dashboard for a lot of different users. And the way that you do that is through the design thinking principles, where you really want to become empathetic and understand the user's needs, define what their needs are, then come up with a whole lot of ideas on how to solve those needs, and then build a prototype. The nice thing about dashboards these days is prototyping is pretty quick. Traditionally, we used to do it on a piece of paper and just prototype that way, and then, but nowadays we're kind of looking at using tools themselves. We can build a dashboard in a day if you want, and then kind of test, and it's a cycle. So if we just go to the next slide. You'll see here, for example, we've created what's called a persona as part of the design thinking methodology, where we've really gone in and the chief commercial officer, you can read, what his thinking was and his understanding and things like that, and what he needed from a dashboard. So it's really about having those conversations with your key stakeholders, understanding the what, why, who, And then also, what do they see? What do they do? What do they feel? So there's a whole methodology behind this, but it's really trying to get a deeper understanding of those stakeholders. The who is critical to understand before you can do the what. So that's design thinking. So if we go into the next slide. So the next one is about action, and here, go to the next slide. It's really about understanding what sort of actions you can take. Now, we saw in the previous slide that the action was to use the field selling force to really drive market share. But Eric Ries has written a lot about vanity and actionable metrics. So vanity, I'll typically give the rosiest picture. So revenue is a vanity metric. There's too many things underlying revenue and how that revenue is impacted, whereas actionable is more about what actions you can take. I want to be able to measure the performance on a weekly basis of my field selling team, which ultimately will turn itself into revenue. But I want to understand how those programs, my field selling team programs, are doing, as opposed to being able to just measure my revenue. So it's very important. We're not saying that we shouldn't have vanity metrics on a dashboard. Executives typically start with vanity metrics, but really we want to start to think about how do we drive those metrics, those revenue metrics, by using the underlying drivers. Go to the next slide. So typically, when you look at a vanity metric, it's normally a lot deeper. So in the example, we had level 1, which is revenue, stores, and then field selling force. So you really want to go from your results to your drivers. They tend to be, you have very little control over revenue. There's so many things that are impacting it. Whereas where you want to be able to do is spend your time focusing on your field selling team, so you have more control over that. So it's really about separating those vanity from actions. Next slide. And here's another way that I like to do more actionable metrics, and it's typically about how do we. This one is plotting various competitors on a graph, and we put it on 2 axes. One is how much they spend on promotions, and then how fast they're growing. So the idea is the more you spend on promotions, the faster you grow. And you'll see that the gray dot at the top right there is investing heavily in promotions, and they're growing very quickly. But you'll see other companies in a competitive landscape aren't doing as well. So for example, take the orange bubble, for example. They're not spending very much money, so they're saving their money. What they're doing there is they're not growing as fast as the market's growing. So that's a conscious decision that they've made. If you take the yellow bubble, for example, these guys are driving growth without spending any money on promotions. When we drilled into this, we found out that they were cutting their price. And then you'll see the guys at the bottom, the other gray, the light gray at the bottom there. These guys are spending money on promotion, but they're not growing. This is a major concern, and can be easily highlighted. So if we flip to the next slide, so you can see here how on a matrix you can then start to put a lot of more detail into kind of understanding where the bubbles are, what are the actions that they need to take, and underlying future drivers, so that you can then start to measure and start to drive the organization in certain directions. If we go to the next slide. So the last one of the tips is really around storytelling. And storytelling is very important. So if we go to the next slide. Typically, the way that I like to build out dashboards is really start with high level. What is I've done my persona. I've spoken to my commercial officer. He wants to know 3 metrics: revenue, margin, and a percentage of budget. Those are the 3 metrics he really cares about. So what you do is you build out, like at a high level, you can build out your metrics. You can build them out in a gauge or a card or whatever. What I like to do is then have what's called a funnel chart underneath it, which basically helps the organization see kind of what's happening where the organization is heading. So I've just done a very simple one here. So you can see, and it's based on budget performance. So you can see Europe is green, so it's 101%, and Americas is behind budget. This immediately, he's got his top level metrics. You can see he's at 98%. He immediately knows where the issue is. It's in Americas. So we can click on Americas and then drive down into the Americas numbers. What I like to do then is to have underneath that my underlying metrics that are actionable. So maybe I would choose something like the one that we saw in the field selling force. And then the great news is that a lot of finance people, they always want to see the details. So I tend to have the table right at the bottom. But you can see how I'm flowing from low detail to high detail as we go down the page. So next slide. And this here we've combined the matrix chart as well with our, this is the same sort of view of the world, and being able to kind of pull out what is the revenue margin percentage of budget. And then I've also, in my table, I've also highlighted things that are behind budget. But what you can see in the matrix table there is I've done margin percentage against budget. So a little red block shows the place where you don't want to be, behind budget and behind your margin percentage. So you're not performing on a kind of a revenue basis, but you're also not making very much money. So, that's kind of one way of looking at the data, which helps to kind of drive behavior. Okay. And the behavior here we're driving is, making sure that people are focused on their margin, not only their budget. Okay, excellent. So the future of analytics, I think, just going to finish it off here, and hopefully we have the time for one or two questions. But, the idea here is, we need to not only look at the historical past, but also think about how do we drive growth within the organization, and how do we leverage data and dashboards to be able to do that. The other one is being able to predict change, and then focusing on what's next. And I think, the evolution, I think we're at a very early stage even now within data analytics and dashboarding. And the future is pretty exciting because I think there's a lot of innovation in things like machine learning as well as data sciences. And I think those are all coming together, and especially in the finance organization, we're seeing a lot more of that new technology and new thinking coming into the finance organization to help us really address these three big areas. So, Annie, I think I'm going to hand it over to you. I think we have another polling question. Oh, just to say thank you very much. And if anybody wants to link with me on LinkedIn, there's a lot of other blogs there that may be of interest.
Great. Let's go ahead and have one question in the Q&A. Again, we'll follow up with all the questions we didn't get to. We had such a great amount of content. James, can you kind of put a fine point on things and just let us know, what are the 2 to 3 most common mistakes that you see that companies make in terms of ineffective dashboarding, and then what are the two or three things that you think people should focus on to get them going the right direction?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges I see within an organization is that they don't have a strategy for dashboards. Dashboards are being created on sort of I need this dashboard, and then somebody goes and creates it, or I need this dashboard and somebody needs to go and create it. I think that the organization needs to kind of step back and have a bigger strategy on what it is they want to be able to do with dashboards, and how they want to drive the organization forward by using dashboards, and have a coherent strategy. Another one of the challenges that I see is often that dashboards all look very different. Where we're trying to drive our organizations, the organizations we work with, is to have what we call a single pane of glass. So we have lots of different data sets. We pull them all into a single view in a dashboard, so that, for example, an executive can switch between data sets, but the dashboard stays the same. So it's about interpreting that dashboard and being able to understand the detail behind that dashboard, and then using different data sets underlying that. So it's really about standardizing your dashboards across the organization. And the final challenge, is about adoption. And I think this is the hardest one. It's great being able to develop dashboards, but if nobody's using them, there's no actual value there. So I think that's about time. So I don't know anything else you'd
Okay.
like to send.
Oh, fantastic. With that, I'll have to close the Q&A sessions. I would like to once again thank James Myers for his great content and insights. Thank you very much, James. I would like to once again thank our sponsor, Centage. We appreciate and share their commitment to thought leadership, which is also evident in the great content and resources they offer, which you can view by visiting the Centage website. Also want to remind everyone that you'll have the opportunity to be requested to be connected with James and our survey sponsor in the post-webinar survey. We will launch immediately following the survey. Finally, thank you, the audience, for your valuable time, and make the rest of your day great, everyone.
Thanks, Annie.